G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. What does it feel like to be cancelled? What does it feel like to be cancelled by the very opposite group of people who you might intuitively have thought would cancel you? Meg Smaker was a firefighter, a young firefighter, in California when 9/11 happened. She empathized with the firefighters who died that day, and she decided to figure out why it happened. And unlike other peers of her age, the way that she decided to do that was to leave the United States, hitchhike by herself through Afghanistan, end up in Yemen, and spend 5 years in Yemen, learning Arabic, studying Islam, and teaching firefighting. Fast forward to her decision to make a documentary film. A documentary film about the Guantanamo Bay detainees who were sent to a specialized Saudi Arabian rehabilitation center for terrorists and jihadists. She made this incredible, humane film about their aspirations and the Saudi government's attempts in collaboration with the United States and other Western powers to reform these people who are otherwise perceived as irredeemable, guilty of the worst possible crimes. And she was worried at the time that there might be some pushback from right-wing anti-Muslim forces or militaristic pro-US forces saying, why are you humanizing these people? That's not where the pushback to her documentary came from. It came from the left. It came from people who hadn't seen the film, who thought that it, by definition, must be a jingoistic, pro-Western attempt to conflate jihadism and terrorism with all of Islam. It's an extraordinary, compelling whirlwind of a story. And when Meg Smaker was in Australia promoting this movie, in spite of all of the efforts to have her silenced, I was so proud and privileged and honoured to have her visit our studio and sit down for a chat. Please enjoy as much as I did the one and only Meg Smaker. You said you're leaving San Francisco. Why?
Leaving the Bay Area.
Leaving the Bay Area.
I was supposed to move before I went on this whole tour thing, but there was an emergency where I have to push it back. But basically, I can't afford to live there anymore.
Right. It's not because the whole place is a steaming wreckage and a pile of human refuse.
So I live in Oakland,
right,
which is across the bay. Which I don't know if you have that here, but like I feel like Oakland's awesome and San Francisco's all right. So.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
and San Francisco is a flaming trash pile, and Oakland has escaped that fate?
It has not, but
I'm not sure if this is true, by the way. I'm just regurgitating what people say
I think,
on the socials.
Here's what I'll say. All over the U.S., I've seen the number of homeless people spike to a level that I've never seen in my entire life. And in places where there was homeless before, like in San Francisco, there's always homeless. Now it's just gotten to such a ridiculous level. And then on top of that, you have places that really you didn't see any homeless like before, and you are seeing it now. So my sister-in-law lives in a place where I've been visiting for years. I've never seen any of that. And now I go there, and this whole kind of street leading to her house has all these tents on it. So it's just I think it's a combination of a severe housing shortage, rise in property values that kind of make it literally just impossible to buy a first-time house if you're not like working for a huge tech company. So yeah.
I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm blaming homeless people for being homeless. Obviously, they wouldn't choose to be homeless if they could avoid being homeless. But it seems to be people seem to blame a combination of homelessness, substance abuse that is not getting treated, and also just a tolerance towards criminality. That's like there seems to be. I used to live in Venice Beach in Los Angeles,
okay,
so I lived there when it was an up and coming place that was rapidly gentrifying in 2010. When people thought, oh, this is going to turn into Santa Monica, and instead Santa Monica turned into Venice, and the whole place has it's just people just say like, my car has been stolen 8 times in the past 3 years, and that's just normal.
My car got in Oakland, my car literally got stolen out of my driveway.
Wow.
Out of my drive. It's all on camera.
So what's that about? Because that's not homelessness, right? I mean, presumably it's not homeless people just coming along going, I think I'll have an Audi.
Well, I remember when the pandemic started, I had a couple of packages stolen and my car got broken into, and I would call the cops, and they just would never come, and they just told me to file a report.
That could be part of the problem, couldn't it? The authorities
So
not
I was like, hey guys,
policing crime.
I pay taxes, so it'd be really nice to, just come to my house and, do something.
So where is the pleasure haven of pleasure and plenty to which you're going to flee where the police do answer the phone?
I'm not fleeing for the police thing. I love living in Oakland because it's like I've lived, I would say, quite a few different places, and it's very unique. It's this kind of amalgamation of different cultures and different, histories and different socioeconomic kind of standings, but not in a segregated way. Like I think I used to live in DC, and it was definitely diverse, but segregated diverse. You had like the rich like professor of Georgetown University neighborhood, and then you had different.
We have lots of black people over there.
Yeah, exactly. But
we go and visit them.
Oakland's quite different. It's very mixed. It's very everyone's on top of each other, and there's this like joke that everyone says in Oakland, like Oakland's 1/4 white, 1/4 black, 1/4 Asian, and 1/4 Hispanic. So if you're not in some kind of interracial relationship, you might be racist.
Right. Okay, so Oakland's great, but it costs $65,000 a month in rent.
It's ridiculous. It's gotten astronomically ridiculously expensive. And I would say that like the reason why I like Oakland is, and why I don't live in LA, is as a storyteller, as a journalist, I want to surround myself with different stories and different viewpoints. And even though I think LA's great for like Hollywood, like you can't swing a dick in LA without hitting someone in the film industry. And if I want different perspectives, different backgrounds, to hear different stories, Oakland's a great place for that.
I mean, in LA, you can go to Pasadena, you can go to
you can go to Glendale,
you can go to Beverly Hills. There are heaps of places. You can go to North Hollywood, West Hollywood, you can go to East Hollywood.
I can't go to a coffee shop though and walk in and not see like 20 people writing their script.
Yeah, I know. It's
or
annoying,
like in Oakland, I go in a coffee shop and some guy's painting a picture. Two guys are like debating over like some kind of like book that just came out about Lenin, and it's just this really cool.
Of course, it's Lenin. Oakland, all those communists. But I mean, I felt the same way about New York as well. I mean, in a positive way, about it being a hodgepodge of different people and a very stimulating place to be because you never knew who you were going to meet.
Yeah.
And yes, there may be a kind of ideological conformism in the sense that it's quite a progressive town, as is the Bay Area.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in Los Angeles, it's funny you mentioned DC as well because DC, I've spent a little bit of time in DC, and it struck me as having to some extent the same problem as Los Angeles, which is that it's a single industry town.
Well, when I was in DC, I was at National Geographic.
Okay.
And so I wasn't in politics. So I loved during the day I'd work at Nat Geo, and then my lunch break I would go to like the Brookings Institute and like listen to like a think tank debate.
Oh, that's cool.
And like that's just how fucking cool is that? You just get to hear like smartest people in the world talk about random shit, and you can ask them questions. Like, I love that.
Yeah, it's still mostly lawyers and politicians and lobbyists in a way that I felt was less stimulating personally than New York.
I think because of where I was working and where I was located, I was much more exposed to like think tanks and scholars and geeky research.
The academic side of Washington, D.C. Yeah. So did you always want to be a journalist? Did you always want to be a storyteller?
No.
What were you after?
Well, when I was younger, I don't know, this might get me canceled again. I asked my friend this question the other day, like what she wanted to be when she grew up, and I think she said she wanted to be a doctor. So like, what was the first thing you wanted to be? This is like really embarrassing to say, but we'll be truthful. The first thing I wanted to be was a taxi driver, because I thought it was I thought driving was so cool. So at age 4, I was like, you get paid to drive? What an awesome job. And you get to go everywhere. So that was the first thing I wanted to be. And the second thing I wanted to be, and this is really embarrassing, is a prostitute. I had just seen Pretty Woman, and I just thought being a prostitute meant you can be in bubble baths all day long and people buy you expensive stuff.
Sure.
And that's just great.
Wow. And did you ever achieve either of those dreams?
I did not.
We can still work on it. We can still work on it. I can probably help with the taxi driver bit, less so with the prostitution angle.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
So, and how did you get from wanting to be a taxi driver prostitute to living in Yemen?
So I was a firefighter. So I wound up when I was 18. So I was 1998 to 2003-4. I was a firefighter in California, and I loved it. it's a great job. Every day is different. You get to work in a team. I don't know how you're wired, but I really thrive in fast-paced, high-stakes problem solving. It's kind of like my jam. And that's kind of all firefighting is. You arrive on scene, you have a couple seconds to like take in all the information and make decisions and come up with a plan of attack and go to it. So whether it's arriving on scene of a gunshot victim or a structure fire or a plane crash or a chemical spill, it's great because you're constantly being challenged.
And is there enough of that actually going on that's how you spend your days? Because I just assume that you spend 99% of the time sitting around playing cards and then 1% of the time terrified.
It depends on the time of year and the station that you're stationed at. Like there's some stations that just roll all the fucking time, and there's some stations that maybe go on a call every couple days or every week. There was
to get a cat from a tree.
I've never had to get a cat from a tree, but I did have to get a peacock from an attic once.
Is that true?
Yes.
Really?
And it was they're really violent. They're really violent animals. Yeah.
They strike me as an ornery kind of
animal.
animal.
They're kind of like, I think when you're that pretty, you can be a dick and get away with it.
Right.
So they're like the pretty dicks of the animal world. You know?
Also, they don't belong in an attic, so he's probably already upset.
I don't know how it got up there. I just know that was the call, and I just remember I'd take a cat in a tree over a peacock in an attic any day of the week.
That's very nice. But so in terms of planes crashing, relatively infrequent.
Planes crash. I only went on
blessedly infrequent.
I only went on one plane crash as a firefighter. But we went on where I was stationed. We had two calls that were quite like almost every day. Was vehicle accidents because I was stationed on one of the Blaze highways in the U.S. So we went on a lot of multi-car pileups and stuff. And then in California, we used to have a fire season, but now it's year-round. Mm-hmm. But on fire season, we'd just be rolling all the time.
Yeah.
And we go out on strike teams, which are when they have huge fires in California, you need to reallocate your resources. And so places that aren't burning as much, they would send these things called strike teams out, which is 5 engines, and you go to a different unit to kind of attack that like 1,000-acre fire and go to town. It's
crazy.
Fun.
And the same firefighters do urban fires as do bushfires?
So in California is really unique because I was stationed at like a more urban area, but it butts up against more rural area. So like, for example, if you live in San Francisco Fire Department is your fire department. But outside of major cities, all the rest of that is covered by CAL FIRE. And so a lot of the times during fire season, you'll work with big fire departments that are more municipal fire departments, but then you need their resources. So you train together a lot. But yeah, I think not all. I would say like I was in a very unique situation in terms of my battalion because we had a major metropolitan area, but we also had a lot of vegetation as well. So
it seems kind of interesting.
We did both. Yeah, it's great.
I mean, we have huge bushfires here in Australia, as you know, but we don't. The same people who put out your house fire are not the people who are going to fight the bushfire. They're two separate entities.
Well, I mean, we have different engines for that, but I think that like the thing about California is when you call 911, whether you've just been shot or you have difficulty breathing or your house is on fire or your meth lab has exploded or whatever, you get the fire department.
Yeah. I noticed that in New York as well. The fire department goes everywhere. They're all purpose. They're not just for fires.
Yeah, so you'll have on your fire department or on your engine, depending on what you have, you'll definitely have, everyone will be an EMT. You'll probably have one medic.
Right.
So like if you have a gunshot wound, we need to be able to take care of you.
Right. But doesn't the ambulance, why don't you give yourself the day off? Let the paramedics take care of the gunshot wound, unless it's a flaming gunshot.
Well, the way that I would say that like the fire departments, when you do a city planning, they're equal distance apart, right? So like if this is a table, is your city, you won't have all your engines here. You'll have one here, one here, one there.
Right.
So when someone calls,
they might be closer than an ambulance.
Yeah, we almost all, because usually you have your ambulances will be in an engine bay if they're a private company. Sometimes you have ambulances as part of a fire department. So it kind of depends on the city and the county and what you guys have worked out. But it differs per county. But in the county that I was in, we did it all.
Right. So the fire engine is usually the first vehicle on the scene. If you call 911, that's why it shows up. Now you've just answered a question for me. I never knew. I was like, why are they doing so much stuff?
I mean,
They're
I could lie and say
because
we're faster at getting in there.
Well, you've got the pole to swirl down as well to get into.
Yeah, my station didn't have a pole, but
Don't ruin Christmas for me by telling me that. So Saudi Arabia,
just jumping all over the place.
Here we go. They call me Segway Josh for nothing. Saudi Arabia launches this scheme because the United States has a bazillion people in Guantanamo Bay that it can't get rid of, or they already had the scheme.
No.
Okay.
So we should probably tell them who I am. I don't know how this works.
I'll introduce you, and I'll tell them that you're a filmmaker and that I've seen the film, and they should see the film.
Okay, there you go. What's the film? What's the film about, Josh?
Well, it's interesting because the film ends up being about something a little bit different than I thought it was going to be about initially. But I mean, I would describe the.
What did you think it was going to be about initially?
I don't want to spoil it, so I'll only talk about what it is, and then we can talk about what I think it actually also ends up being about later. But what I thought it was about, and what it spends most of its time on, is this collection of people who are being quote unquote de-radicalized by a center in Saudi Arabia, which is seeking to de-radicalize Yemeni terrorists and jihadists who've been
not
from
Yemeni.
Guantanamo Bay.
Well, I mean, there's lots of people that go there.
Aren't the two main ones Yemen?
I mean,
two of the three main people?
There's four main characters, and three of them, or four of the main characters are Yemeni. There's one Saudi in there, but the center itself. Up until those guys, it was only for Saudi nationals.
Right, and then this deal, this Gitmo deal, ends up sending these Yemeni detainees.
So basically, I heard about this center back in when I was living in Yemen. So I lived in Yemen for almost 5 years, and I was there teaching and running a firefighting academy. And I first heard about it because there was a terrorist attack, I think in 2007 or so, in Saudi Arabia, and I overheard a conversation, and according to my cadets at the time, the perpetrators of the attack had been caught. Half of them were Yemeni, and the other half were Saudi. And according to them, the Yemenis were tortured and killed, and the Saudis were sent to something that they referred to as Jihad Rehab. And I didn't know the word for rehabilitation in Arabic, so I had asked someone. They said it's Jihad Rehab, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. But it was weird because at the time, I was like, why is the most conservative country in the world running some progressive rehab program for terrorists? And it just always kind of struck me as kind of weird. Years later, when I started working on this project and I learned the origin story of the center and how it came to be, then it made more sense. How much do you know about Saudi Arabia?
Try me.
How much do you know about the year 1979? In Saudi Arabia.
Is that the revolution year? Well, there was an Iranian revolution in 79.
There was an Iranian revolution in 79, and there was three things that happened that year that kind of changed the trajectory of Saudi Arabia. So you had the Ayatollah coming to power, and that was a direct threat to the Saudi royal family and them staying in power because he kind of painted them as, puppets of the Satan American government. And what you have to understand about the Saudi royal family is they care about one thing and one thing above all else, and that's staying in power. And so when that threat happened, kind of right after that, there was a siege on Mecca. So as the leader of Saudi Arabia, you're also responsible for some of the two holiest sites in Islam, which is Mecca and Medina. And a group of men took Mecca over and occupied it and killed a bunch of people, which also threatened the legitimacy of the leadership at the time. And on top of that, that same year, the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And the royal family was kind of called out as not being legitimate because they couldn't, protect the mosque, and Iran was kind of calling out the same thing as well. And so to bolster their, I would say, Islamic credentials, they started to kind of get more restrictive in terms of at home. So where before 1979 you would see women on TV and giving interviews and not covered up, after that changed. And then they also encouraged their young men to go out and fight the Russians, as we did as well. And so that kind of bolstered their credentials as Islamic leaders because they were fighting this country that had invaded this Islamic country, and that, I would say, encouragement continued. So you had young Saudi men going to places like Afghanistan to fight the Russians, and Chechnya and Bosnia. And for decades, this was an export-only business. And then 2001 happened, and 9/11. And you had these men who had been fighting in these conflicts all over the globe. And then when America invaded Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden went to his men, and he said, return to your home countries and regroup. And so you had hordes of battle-hardened Saudi extremists coming back to Saudi Arabia, and with them they brought the fight. And so for the first time in Saudi's history, they had this huge spike of domestic terrorism, the likes of which they'd never seen before. And initially, the Saudis used the same tactics as the Americans: imprison, torture, kill. The problem is, if I imprison you and torture you and kill you, what then happens to your 7 brothers? They then become radicalized. So it just exacerbated the problem. So the Saudis kind of did different experiments, and one of them was in Saudi Arabia, the terrorist and prisons are separate from the normal criminal prisons for obvious reasons. You don't want someone who has a skill set of like hacking and stealing cars to then become radicalized. So in the terrorist prison, they started this program of religious study, counseling, art therapy, and they tracked these guys, and they actually had good progress with it. And so from that, they made the center. And so it wasn't like a case of Saudis trying to take people back from Guantanamo. It was more of the chickens had come home to roost, and they needed to deal with it. Because again, like I said, if there was instability in the kingdom, that threatened the legitimacy of the royal family. And
right. But your film begins with the repatriation of the Guantanamo detainees to this center in Saudi Arabia. That's where this story begins, and the people who you've chosen to focus on are these largely Yemenis coming from Gitmo. And presumably, I mean, this was at a stage when the United States was trying to get rid of all the Gitmo detainees and knew that this was unsustainable, right? And so a lot of countries took them and did whatever with them, these particular individuals. I mean, why is it that the Yemenis were sent there? I mean, obviously you don't want to send them back to Yemen because there's a war there and you're afraid that they're going to turn into terrorists. But why is Saudi Arabia willing to take them in the first place?
Well, they sent a bunch of them to different places. But the problem with the Yemeni population, why there were so many left in Guantanamo, is unlike other countries. I would say if you look at who got released from Guantanamo when, it had less to do about what the people did and more to do about the United States government relationship with that country. So, for example, we have a closer relationship with the Saudi government, and the Saudis were sent home way before a lot of the Yemenis were. So if you see in the movie, the guy who opens the movie, Khalid, he was one of the lead bomb makers and bomb instructors for Al-Qaeda. He only spent like 5 years in Gitmo, and then he got sent back. Where someone like Ali, who was Yemeni, all he did was go to a training camp, and he spent 16 years, almost 16 years in Guantanamo. I think part of that had to do with his country not having that kind of close relationship with the United States and being able to negotiate release. And also, Yemen was just not stable enough to send these guys back in a way that they could be tracked and kind of reintegrated into society.
And if anyone's good at tracking and making sure that people aren't going to do the wrong thing, it's the Saudis. It's not like they have such a high respect for human rights that they're not going to be able to look after people and make sure they don't do the wrong thing and then make them go away if they do.
Yeah, they know where all these guys are at. For
sure. So this, I guess this is part of, what is this, a favor that the Saudis are doing to the US? Is this a face-saving thing where, okay, we'll let you get these people off your hands because we know that they can't spend the rest of their lives in Gitmo?
No. So again, if you look back, thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that the U.S. government approached Saudi Arabia to take these men back in 2009, and they refused. And they said that, this program is only for Saudi nationals. It's specifically based on our culture. Like we can't take them through this program. But my understanding is that fast forward to 2016, when the U.S. government was in negotiations with Iran to kind of have that peace deal going on, or the nuclear weapons thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I need to have a second coffee for the day. It's called the nuclear weapons thing. Oh my God, I'm going to get canceled again. All right. So basically we were in negotiations with that, and then Saudi Arabia wanted more weapons because of that from the United States. And so part of that deal was, you have to take some of these guys from Gitmo.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what's interesting about that was if in the movie, you're only allowed to go through this program if you have someone that's going to agree to be your sponsor when you're released. And that sponsor is liable for anything that you do once you're released from the program,
Right.
i.e., if I'm your dad and I'm your sponsor and I sign on that dotted line and you decide to graduate from the program and then abscond and join Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, I then take your place in prison. So there's a big motivation not to do that. So all the men that they took from Guantanamo to Saudi Arabia had to have at least one family member in Saudi willing to be their sponsor. So there was more Yemenis, and there still is more Yemenis in Guantanamo, but they just didn't have family members.
And a lot of these guys, I mean, it's kind of weirdly heartbreaking in a way that they were, 16 when they got picked up in Afghanistan. I mean, what do you know when you're 16? What do you even know about your life or what you believe in or what you're doing? And
I'm just so glad they didn't have cell phones with cameras when I was 16.
Exactly. Then you spend the next 16 years in Guantanamo Bay. You find yourself back at this center in Saudi Arabia. And I mean, one of the characters says something interesting. He says you can't defeat an idea with force.
Yeah, that was one of the instructors at the center. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do they defeat the ideas with, and how successful are they?
That's a good question. I think initially when I started working on this project, I didn't realize how complex and nuanced and varied the motivations are for why people join these groups. And during the course of the project, I interviewed over 150 of these guys. And of that 150, about 30 were interested in doing the project. And of the 30, only 12 were interested in doing the project without their faces being blurred and stuff. So I concentrated on those guys. But after interviewing 150 of them, not all, but most of them would fall into one of 4 categories in terms of their motivation about why they join these groups. And I think for me, different things that you see in the movie kind of address those different motivations. So really quickly, the motivations are the cause, which is people who believe it's their religious duty to go and do this. And so, for example, that's Abu Ghanem. He saw what was happening in Bosnia, Muslims being slaughtered, and he thought it was his religious duty to go there and defend them. And I think that's the one that most Americans are familiar with. But the other 3 have absolutely nothing to do with religion. And they are economic necessity. That's Nader. This became a career for him, a job. It's how he made a living. The third one is pure pressure. That's Ali. His brother was an Al-Qaeda instructor in Al-Faruq training camp. And the last one, which is more age-dependent, the younger guys, it's sense of adventure. And that's Muhammad, where he says, I was bored. I was 19. I didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to go to work. This guy offered me a free ticket to Afghanistan. And I thought, why not? So I think in terms of when you're watching the movie and you see a class on, the rules of jihad according to the Quran, that's for those guys who were motivated by religious reasons. But then you watch a class about how to make a budget and how to write a resume, and you're like, what does this have to do with it? But those are for those guys who this became a job for them. This became a career. And so that addresses that kind of need. And so there's loads of different classes and courses they do there to kind of address those different things. And some of it works with some of them and some of them doesn't. Some guys really love the art of therapy. Other guys think it's stupid.
Yeah, right.
So it's kind of we're all these individual snowflakes, all unique. Not like the new snowflake, but the actual snowflake.
Actually being a fingerprint, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that one commonality between all of them does seem to be an appreciation. They receive an appreciation that the fight was counterproductive in some way. It strikes me that they all have some sort of epiphany around... when one of them says, I didn't realize 9/11 was going to be such a big thing. A building fell down, build another building. It's not that buildings fall down all the time. So people die. You lost 2 buildings. We lost 2 countries when you invaded the countries. Those may be 2 different people who I'm channeling there. But that kind of attitude of what goes around comes around. Deal with it, America. And then they've realized that the way that they responded, is counterproductive. It only brings more hardship than...
Yeah.
Achieving anything.
What was interesting talking to Khalid, the bomb maker, is we talked about that specifically. And he said, I asked him, I'm like, would you ever kind of go back to that life? And he just threw up his hands. He's like, look what we accomplished. The world is worse off today than it was when we started this. And he's like, no. He's like, I see where at that time ISIS was more of an issue. When I was talking to him, he's like, look at what, Al-Qaeda, kind of morphed into this, and then that morphed into that, and that gave us ISIS, and look where we're at right now. And it just was this kind of deterioration of what his view of was the goals that they were going after versus the actual results of what happened. And so I think that with him, because he was definitely more ideologically motivated, that he felt like he had been not just led astray, because he had a lot of animosity towards Osama bin Laden because he knew him and he'd moved to Afghanistan because of him. And then when, according to him, Osama bin Laden kind of cut and run when things went bad and like left all these men behind, it left quite a sour taste in his mouth. So yeah, it was interesting to see the different men having kind of different motivations, but all coming to the same conclusion of like, this is probably not the best way forward anymore.
Yeah. And when you say that some of them were just doing it out of economic necessity because, like, you know, Al-Qaeda paid the bills, or the Taliban, you know,
give you a house,
would give you a house, and treat you well, and what else are you going to do with your life in a state of economic scarcity? When I said earlier that the film ends up being about something a little bit different than it seems to be, I was pointing to the fact that these guys' lives all change when MBS comes on the scene, the current ruler of Saudi Arabia, and so I thought what was fascinating about the final quarter of the film is that it's about how, you know, people might have seen the sort of glossy image that Saudi Arabia is currently presenting to the world. You've got the Live golf tournament, and you've got Greg Norman, and you've got Justin Bieber performing in Riyadh, and you know, they're presenting this kind of we're now open to the world and we're modernizing and aggressively. We want to become Dubai, essentially.
Yeah, that's a really good statement, because this was years ago. I think this was 2018, 19. I was talking to someone in the government, and he used those exact words. He's like, we're going to be the new Dubai. That was the goal.
We're bigger, we're richer, we can do it better. But as part of that, there's this crackdown on terrorism and this radical, you know, sort of authoritarianism that comes in. We heard about the death of Jamal Khashoggi and the journalist who've been killed in Saudi Arabia and so on. And as a result, these guys who were about to be released from the center at the end of your film find that they're not going to be released, not on anything like the timeline that they thought. And when they are released, they're not going to be able to get jobs because they're not Saudis. So Saudis, if you're a Saudi in Saudi Arabia, you get all kinds of welfare benefits from oil revenue. But if you're a non-Saudi,
it's a little bit harder.
They're not allowed to leave the country. Obviously, the US would never have released them from Guantanamo Bay if there hadn't been a guarantee that they're never going to be allowed to leave Saudi Arabia. So they're stuck there and they can't work. And what's next?
Well, it's interesting because I think what I like about that part of the film is a lot of times we see headlines, you know, about things that are happening. Like I remember when Obama signed the Paris Accord and then Trump overturned it. That was a headline. And it was one administration went out and then the new administration was like, all right, we're not doing that anymore. But very rarely do we get to see those macro decisions and the effect on a micro level on individuals, right? So MBS, Mohammed bin Naif, the crown prince before Mohammed bin Salman, this center was his pet project, and he was very heavily involved in it. And when he went out and MBS came in, this was no longer a priority because MBS had the war in Yemen, he had all this other stuff, trying to diversify the economy. And so this center was no longer a priority. So these guys kind of just fell through the cracks. And I think it's really interesting to see those macro decisions and how they affect individuals and individual human beings on a micro level. Because I think sometimes we forget about that when we see these like big headlines about big ideas and big treaty signed, but the actual knock-on effect on human beings can be quite catastrophic.
Did you feel sorry for the terrorists?
I would say that when you spend 3 years with someone, unless you're a complete psychopath, you're going to have some kind of emotional investment in that fellow human being. And it was funny when their release was delayed indefinitely because they weren't sure when they were getting out. Muhammad and Ali were really upset. Nader was stoked though. He was like really stoked on staying there. He loved the center. That one scene where he's like, I don't know, maybe I'll ask for more time. I got like an Olympic swimming pool and a sauna and a gym. This is great. But when they got out and they were struggling, I remember one time I was with Ali and it was clear that he was depressed. and really lonely. And of course, I've felt bad for him. I remember that one time I just put down the camera. I was like, let's just go get some fasa, which is like that's Yemeni dish, and just hang out and like human beings and talk to one another. Because he was really, really, really having a hard time and struggling actually making friends, because he was living in a pretty small town compared to Jeddah, and everyone knew who he was. And because of that, no one was talking to him and everyone was avoiding him because they didn't want that kind of negative stigma to kind of rub off on their family's reputation. So yeah, it was really hard for him to be ostracized from your community is difficult, but it's doubly difficult in that part of the world because unlike the United States is a very individualistic society where the Middle East is way more community driven and way more family driven. And so when you are ostracized in a very community oriented in culture, it's really, really, really painful. Yeah.
When was the last time you were in touch with him?
I heard from Nader a couple days ago. So, yeah, I mean, Ellie, it's been a little bit. But yeah, I heard from Nader a couple days ago. Yeah.
How's he doing?
Do you want an update on the guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So, since the movie, Ellie's had his second child, a girl, and he's really come into his own as a father. And I really think he kind of found his purpose in life. Muhammad, unfortunately, his dad died of COVID-19, and since then he's been having quite a rough go of it. Nader, still not married, still no job, and he always wants me to ask, so if any ladies out there...
If you have had your eye on an ex-terrorist, then he's your man.
He's a good guy. He's a good guy. But yeah, I think that I guess when my phone was like blowing up during the World Cup, and it was Nader, and I was like, wow, what's happening? I was really worried, and I didn't realize that I guess Saudi Arabia had beat Argentina.
All right.
And Nader's a huge soccer fanatic, and he was going nuts. He was just yelling in the phone. He's like, Saudi Arabia! And then they got kicked off. Then they got knocked out. But then Morocco was doing really good.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It was there was a source of pride there, and I didn't need to watch the World Cup because I was just getting updates from Nader.
I love it. So, I mean, if you have empathy for these people, then one would expect that the flack that you would get, the backlash that you would get, if any, for this kind of journalism is that you're an apologist for terrorists and that you're anti-American and that you're pro-jihadist in some way.
Well, that would be way over the line, but I can see that.
That would be the at least a comprehensible straw manning of your position, right? I mean, it's straw womaning, shall we say, straw personing. But what ended up happening was that. Well, what did end up happening?
Yeah, so I made this film, and in the independent space, so I didn't make this film for a broadcaster or a studio. So in the independent space, how you get your film out in the world is you submit it to some film festivals, and if you're lucky enough, you get into a big one. And I was extremely lucky because I got in all the big ones. I submitted the film, and it got into Sundance and South by Southwest and Toronto and San Francisco, and kind of everyone wanted this film. And I just felt really lucky and just humbled because I thought we're going to premiere this film at the biggest film festival in the world, which is Sundance.
And what generally happens then is that a studio will buy the film and will distribute it.
Someone will pick it up like Netflix or Hulu or A24, and then usually it's Sundance. In my category, there was 10 films, and usually 5 of those films winds up being nominated for an Oscar. They become the IT films of the year.
Exactly. And if you're lucky, there's a bidding war for it. And, you end up...
You can pay back your investors.
Exactly. And
hopefully your student loans.
Hopefully making even more money and getting a piece of the action on whatever ticket sales are.
Yeah.
If it gets a theatrical release.
Sundance is supposed to not just launch the film's like trajectory, but also it changes your life and it launches your career in a way that is... It's kind of, I've seen filmmakers go there with films, and they went from making indie films to then, directing Jurassic Park World or whatever. It's a game changer. So, I
like that you don't know the name of Jurassic World. That's a feather in your cap, really, that you don't know the names.
I love the first one, but everything after that, it was just a little lackluster.
Don't worry, I haven't seen Jurassic World either. So you get accepted into Sundance and South by and all these festivals, and then what happens?
And then I was elated, and they tell you you're not allowed to tell anyone. So the only people I told were my team and my grandma, because she was really old. And my grandma had... When I started working on this project like 7 years ago, I told her about it. That the next day she went out and she bought a gown because she was like, I'm going to go to the Oscars. I'm going to be your date. I was like, oh, Grandma, I didn't say you're going to be my date, but I guess you do. I do now. But she was getting older, and so I wanted to tell her about it. And unfortunately, she died right before Sundance. But yeah, she was like my biggest cheerleader and supporter. So I told her, but everyone else had to be involved in the film. And honestly, like, she doesn't really know anyone in the film industry, so I figure it's not a big deal. If she says to people at her retirement home, they probably think she's just like, you know, being like all like dementia and stuff.
Yeah, just as long as she's not overheard talking about it at the Beverly Hilton.
So we didn't really tell anyone outside the team, and then Sundance made the announcement. And then the day after Sundance made the announcement, which is almost about 2 months before the film premiered. So about 2 months before anyone had actually seen the film. The day after the announcement, the attacks started, and they just continued and escalated and haven't stopped since.
Attacks meaning what?
Well, at the time, I didn't really know what was going on because I wasn't privy to other things that were happening behind the scenes. Because I'm a journalist, I did a deep dive into this to try to figure it out later. But basically, there were 6 filmmakers who kind of organized attacks against the film in a letter writing campaign, and they wrote Sundance letters and anonymously. We didn't know who these people were, but Sundance did. And then Sundance met with them, and they heard their demands, again, having not seen the film, and they would take those demands to me and demand that I did these things. And then that went back.
Things like what?
So one of them was they wanted me to, and this has never been done before in the history of film festivals, and they didn't ask any other film that year to do this, but they wanted me to have the film reviewed by an ethics review board. And this would mean that there was a third party who wasn't involved in the film, who would review the film and interview me and interview my producer and look at all of our paperwork and make sure everything was on the up and up. Now, we already have lawyers that do that. So in order for my film to go on HBO or Netflix, you have to have a lawyer vet your film and make sure you have all the right permissions and personal releases and everything's been licensed and stuff like that. And that's something we normally do. But this ethics review board was weird to me because you're basically asking someone who's never stepped foot in Saudi Arabia, who's never spent any time with these men, who knows zero about the region, to basically say if your film's on the up and up or not. And I think for me, Sundance gave us 6 demands, that was one of them, to do in 48 hours, which is ridiculous. And I took that as a way of they were looking for an excuse to pull the film.
They gave you 48 hours to agree to the demands or 48 hours to complete the demands?
Complete the demands. And this was, so
And just to clarify, the people who were writing in saying that there's a problem with the film, their claim that there was a problem with the film was based on what? What was their problem? What did they think the ethics board needed to sign off on?
So I can tell you some of the stuff that they were accusing of, and having seen the film, you're going to laugh at this. So the first thing they accused us of is making a film that was Saudi propaganda funded by the Saudis. Yeah, I can see your face.
Okay.
Having seen the film, you're like,
right.
Okay. And then it was that the film was made by an all-white film team who knew nothing about the Middle East and completely done by white supremacists and who are Islamophobic. Now, they didn't know at the time that my executive producer is Muslim, my co-producer was Muslim, our assistant editor was Muslim, and we worked with 2 Islamic scholars and an imam. And then it was the men didn't give consent. They were forced to do this. They didn't know that I'd interviewed over 150 of these guys, and only, 12 of them were interested in doing the project. And if you'd watch the film, you see one person leave halfway through. So clearly they were free to leave anytime. And then another one was that the film put the men's life in danger and they're going to be killed if this film was ever sees the light of day. And it was a safety issue. Again, they don't know how Saudi Arabia works and never been there and never contacted these men. And so it's basically throwing just everything at the wall and accusing the film of everything just to try to get it, blacklisted. And they were successful.
And were these fellow filmmakers or well-meaning activists?
Well, They were, at the time I didn't know who they were, but later on they are all, there was 6 documentary filmmakers who were Muslim, and they started this whole campaign, and they applied to Sundance and not gotten in, and that was also an issue that they took up with Sundance. How come you're programming her film? She's not Muslim, she's not Arab. She shouldn't be telling the stories. You should be programming our films, which I understand that, but again, I'm not Sundance and I didn't choose these films. And so I think that I am very for inclusivity and different representations being platformed. However, I am staunchly against like exclusion, meaning only I as a woman can tell stories about women. You as a man should not even be allowed to interview women because what do you know about being a woman? Like, I completely disagree with that kind of stance. I know that there are people in the documentary world who subscribe to that. I do not, because I think that would negate all of journalism, basically. That means that if you're someone who isn't Jewish, you can't really understand the Holocaust. I think we're all human beings, and the shared life experiences that we have goes far beyond the boxes that you might check on some census, like your race, your ethnicity, your sex. And what I mean by that is I interviewed a lot of these guys, and on paper, we had absolutely nothing in common, you know? So one of the guys I clicked with right away, Nader, I remember one of the first times I interviewed him, he was telling me stories of things that he did and things that were done to him. And these were pretty horrific things. But he was doing this kind of through all of like bouts of uncontrolled laughter and through off-color jokes. Now, what you have to understand is when you're a firefighter, you see a lot of horrific shit. And you kind of have to find a way to process it and to decompress and to move on to go to the next call. And how firefighters, or at least the ones that I worked with, chose to do that was through humor. And like really dark, very politically incorrect humor. That I think if anyone heard it, we'd probably get fired. But it helped you get through the day. And I hadn't really ever seen that kind of humor outside of firefighters and then military folks who'd seen combat. But other than that, I really hadn't ever witnessed that kind of really dark sense of humor until I met Nader. And I remember being in the room and hearing these jokes that he would tell. And this is like, I remember one of the first things he said to me is like, Meg, you should go on the Guantanamo diet. You lose 40 pounds in 1 month, be good for you. And I'm like, he's talking about going on a hunger strike. Yeah. Wow. No, I mean, like, I am like the most out of shape I've ever been. They have like the freshman 15. This is like the canceled 35. Like, it's just like, it's not being canceled sucks for your body. Oh, but yeah, so we're in this room, and at the time there was other men in the room. There was other Arabs and Muslims in the room. And I remember talking to them afterwards, and they all believed that Nader was some kind of psychopath because he was laughing at this stuff. And I knew better. I knew that wasn't true because I saw that kind of humor came from a place of kind of processing, like really going through the shit, going through really intense stuff. Yeah. And so there was that connection that we had, and like I would tell a joke and then he would tell them back, and then we just like made each other laugh over our shared love of inappropriate humor. And, you know, found this connection, this human connection that they don't have. It's not, you can't check this on some box of like a survey of like, I'm Muslim, I'm Arab, I'm a woman. Like on paper, he was a 44-year-old Muslim Arab man and an ex-Al-Qaeda member. I was a 36-year-old American ex-firefighter and a woman. And again, on paper, nothing in common. But human beings are so much more than what you'd see on like some boxes and some census.
Well, also, I mean, yeah, as you say, like what would it do to the creative arts and to journalism if we took the narrowest possible interpretation of who can explore what stories? Yeah. I mean, I encountered this, of course, all the time being a radio host, where we try to be as diverse as possible in the people we speak to. But and of course, if you were talking about if I wanted to do a story in which I wanted to understand what it's like to be a firefighter, then I need to talk to a firefighter, right? You know, and if I want to do a story about what it's like to be a female firefighter, then I need to speak to a female firefighter. But if I want to do a story about the appropriate number of firefighters that there ought to be in Australia, or how we're going to fund firefighting or so on, then you don't actually have to necessarily speak to a firefighter. And if I want to do a story about the history of Belgium, I don't necessarily need to speak to a Belgian person. And increasingly, there is an assumption that you actually do need to speak to a Belgian person if you're talking about Belgium. This happens all the time also in novels.
You know you're about to get cancelled in Belgium, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's right. The Belgians will hate me. It happens all the time in novels as well. People will say, why are you publishing this novel that is supposed to be from a migrant experience or a transgender experience or a gay experience if it's not written by...
Did you read that article in the New York Times about American Dirt and what happened to that book?
American Dirt's a good example, right? I mean, this is which I still want to read because my mum tells me it's a fantastic book, and I told her, you're not supposed to read that, Mum. That's been cancelled because it wasn't written by it, and she was like, oh, fuck that. I mean, what a load of bullshit. It's a great book. Nonetheless, when people say, well, why was that book published instead of all of these other books that were written by people who come from that community? I mean, the only legit answer is the people from that community should have written that book. They didn't write that book, and the other Muslim filmmakers didn't make your film. Yeah. If they wanted to get accepted to Sundance, they should have made your film because on its merits, that's the one that was regarded as being the best one for Sundance in the opinion of the people who judge such things, namely the judges at Sundance. I mean, it is a bit I can understand, we are Muslim filmmakers and we don't get our stories told, and here's this woman who's not a Muslim who's focusing on jihad and terrorism, and she does get amplified. Yeah. Why don't we get amplified? Maybe the films weren't as good.
Well, I think that... So I always like to be fair with people and give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that there are some really great films out there that are made by Arabs and different people and different ethnicities and different religions. And I will say that there is a propensity on certain subject matters to kind of cover a subject over and over and over again. For example, they are correct when they say there is a disproportionate number of films made about Muslims that are only about terrorism. That's true. And I think that if there was a more diverse catalog that was available to a broader populace and not just like these niche film festivals that have these stories then I think that I wouldn't have had to go to Afghanistan after 9/11 to try to find some answers. Because
I mean, I would push back on that a bit. I think if you're including in the cohort of films fictional movies, then that's absolutely true. Yeah. But if you're talking about long form journalism, then I think there is
I'm talking about
actually
just movies.
The reverse bias. I think there's an overwhelming desire, at least among my colleagues in the media, to make sure that any stories that you do about Muslims that you're bending over backwards to make it clear that Islam is a peace-loving religion, that it is that has nothing to do with jihad. That is fundamental to almost every long-form news piece that's been done about Islam in the past 10 years.
I'm specifically referring to fiction films because that's no offense, and this is to put myself in this category, but most people don't. Unfortunately, in America, a lot of people get their facts and stuff from Hollywood movies.
Of course, but Sundance was judging a documentary category.
That's true. I think that the imam that has been helping us on the film, he came to one of the screenings, and this is how we met. So when you're editing a documentary film, you do screenings along the way to make sure that what you're kind of editing and the story structure is making sense, and what you want to come through is coming through. And so you do kind of these test screenings and get people's feedbacks. And he came to one, and he told me afterwards, he said, when I heard there was going to be a film about your film, I thought, not another film about terrorism and jihadism. We don't need any more of these. He's like, but then I saw your film, and I thought, if you're going to watch one film about terrorism, this is a film I want everyone to watch.
It's incredibly humanizing.
Yeah.
So at the risk of drawing this out too long, I know you've rehashed this a million times and you probably don't want to relive it endlessly, but suffice it to say, one of the things that sticks in one's craw the most about all this is that not only was there a campaign from outside the film to cancel the film and for it to be pulled from Sundance, and not only was Sundance cowardly enough to capitulate to that campaign seemingly, but then people who'd worked with you on the film started distancing themselves from it and saying that...
That was the hardest part. That was the hardest part. Because, like, so one of our executive producers on the film was this woman named Abigail Disney, who, like, for the first, what you have to understand is it's really hard to raise funding for an independent documentary in general. But if you're a woman trying to raise money for a film that you're doing where you're going to go to Saudi Arabia to, like, try to understand terrorists on a human level, it's near fucking impossible. No one wants to give you money. No one wants to give you money. So we were able to get little, like, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 here and there. And then the first big investor we had was Abigail Disney. And she was great. She came in at just such a quintessential time, and it allowed me to go over and film for long periods of time. And she was such a huge supporter of the film, and she would reach out to other people that she knew that were high worth individuals and connect them with me. And she was such a strong supporter of the film, and she'd seen multiple cuts, and she was super like really enthusiastic and gave just really great notes and was really, really supportive of both me and the film. And over those 4 years, we kind of developed a friendship. And when the attacks first happened, she was, pretty supportive. But then when they kind of reached their apex, and what I mean by that is when the film premiered at Sundance, it just escalated the attacks, because what happened was they took screenshots of our credits and then reached out to people in our credits who were in the film industry and kind of threatened them and said, if you don't take your name off the film, we're going to call you out as an Islamophobe or a white supremacist. And we went from having 400 people in our credits to 400 people in our credits to 40. And so that was hard. I had people call me up saying, like, I love you, I love the film, but I'm scared I'm going to lose my job, so please take my name off the film. And those people I totally respected. I'm like, okay, I don't want you to lose your job over having your name in our credits. But then there was people, and that was all done privately. But then there was someone like Abigail Disney who not only did they, like, call people in our credits, but they also, like, started dragging the more well-known people on Twitter. And so that was Abigail Disney. And then once that started happening, things deteriorated quite quickly. And a person that I'd had, like, I would call her and just talk to her right away, and email her. She'd email me right back. And a person I'd had that relationship with for 4 years, all of a sudden had her assistant send me an email saying, take Abigail's name off the film. We no longer want to be associated with this in any way, shape, or form. And then I reached out to Abigail Disney, and she didn't recall my emails or my calls or my text or anything. And she pretty much ghosted me. And in the beginning, this is before the apology. In the beginning, I was really upset with her, because I thought, man, we've been working together on this film for 4 years. And, like, what a way to treat someone that you'd gotten to know on a human level, just to completely ghost them when they're going through this shitstorm and not to, like, stick by them. And then I went to my best friend, who is the best sounding board, kind of, I think it's really important to have people in your life that call you on your shit. And she's one of them. And she said, it's not fair for you to say that. I was like, what are you talking about? She completely abandoned me in the film. And then she said this to me. She said, not everyone is wired like you. You are extremely good when it comes to, like, high stakes, like, chaotic situations. That's where you thrive. That's why you were a good firefighter. That's why you're really good at places like Somalia and Afghanistan. That's what you do. You cannot expect other people to respond the same way as you do. Like, not everyone's going to keep cool when shit hits the fan. She said, just give her some time and some space and let cooler heads prevail. And eventually she'll see the light of day and she'll come back to the film. Because this was all private at this point. And I was like, shit, you're right. I think it's sometimes, you expect other people to behave in a certain way, and then you forget that not everyone's wired in that same way. And so I kind of gave her some space, and I stopped emailing her and stopped trying to reach out to her. And then I think a couple months later, she issued a statement that she put out in public that completely denounced me in the film. And when you have somewhere like Sundance program a film and play it, and then right after apologize for the film, not once but twice, and then you have the executive producer of that film.
So wait, Sundance did play the film?
They played the film. They wavered quite a bit, and then they played it. And then as soon as they played it, they apologized for doing so. And when an entity as well respected as Sundance apologizes for your film, that's That's like the death blow. And then Abigail Disney, who was an executive producer on the film, when she denounces it publicly, that's the nail in the coffin. And it pretty much killed the film and any chance it had at distribution or playing at any festivals or just ever seeing the light of day. And it pretty much just, it killed the film and it killed my career in all in one go. And yeah, it was hard. It was really, really hard to know. Sundance was one thing, but Abigail Disney knew how hard it was to make this film because we had talked for years over it. And so that was really, really hard pill to swallow.
What did her letter denouncing the film say about the film?
That the film landed like a truckload of hate, and that she was sorry that it perpetuated negative stereotypes. And she pretty much apologized for the film and denounced it as this this piece of work that just perpetuated hate on the Muslim community, which if you see the film, it's like the opposite.
I mean, it's such an interesting. It's so interesting for you. It's unfortunate that this has happened to you, but it's also very interesting as someone who is a reporter and a storyteller from your perspective to be at the eye of a phenomenon that's so widespread at the moment. I mean, we hear punchline arguments in the culture wars about cancel culture and about mob behavior, and most people are tangentially aware of the capacity that we have at the moment to all pile on and to publicly shame people and to get the pitchforks out and the flaming torches and go running through the streets. Like, that's a phenomenon that we're aware of, and you've actually seen the mob form and you've seen people who had the opportunity to stand up to it not and fail. And I wonder whether that's given you any more insights, and is this fodder for another film? Is this
you just want me to relive some more trauma.
Maybe. And are there similarities between the unthinking mob group dynamic of the jihadists and, they are also people who got swept up in a movement, right? I'm
glad you asked me that. So a couple things. Well, two things. I'm gonna forget the second one. So just ask me about Monica Lewinsky in two after I finish the story. Okay. But basically, I spent so much time with men who over 5 years of men who ascribe to a certain ideology, right? So you're either this type of Salafi Muslim, you either believe these specific things, and if you deviate from that just a little bit, then you're not a real Muslim and you're an infidel and you can be targeted. And then I come back to my home country and I experience something that is a different iteration, but a similar kind of ideology in terms of its extremism, to where it's like you're either this type of liberal, you believe these specific things, and if you deviate just a little bit from that, then you're not a real liberal. Then you're sexist or you're homophobic or you're racist, and you can be targeted. And it's really, as someone who has spent a lot of time with men and has seen what an ideology can do if you let it just go to its natural fruition, to see that in my home country is really alarming. And I think that, to be completely honest, and I think I try to be anyway, I was completely naive about how bad things had gotten. And even after it happened to me, I didn't realize how widespread it was, because up until this happened, the only things that I ever heard about was like the controversy over Dave Chappelle and Netflix, or Joe Rogan, or Louis C.K. And even though having the mob come after you and having friends turn on you is like emotionally and just intellectually just wreaks havoc on you, those guys are not going to be homeless because of this. They're still going to have a career. They're still going to be able to pay the bills. And I just thought at that point that getting canceled only happened to super famous people. And when it happened to me, I still didn't think that this was something that was really widespread. I just thought I was pretty unlucky to be in the eye of this storm. And it happened to me because, Sundance is a famous film festival. And so I just kind of got the ire. But then after there was a New York Times piece written about it. And after the New York Times piece came out, I was contacted by a lot of people, animators, journalists, filmmakers, documentarians, illustrators that said the same thing. They all said the same thing. They said, "Oh my God, the exact same thing happened to me." But these are all people that I had never heard about before because they weren't at that Dave Chappelle level. So their work and their career just evaporated into the ether, and I had never heard about it.
Of course. And I mean, you're also the 1% on the tip of the iceberg on the 99% of people who shy away from making that movie in the first place because they've seen the lesson that needs to be taken away from touching subjects like this. I mean, this is something I'm always, walking along a tightrope of as well, working for a public broadcaster and having to, maintain, always being susceptible every single day to cancellation and to accusations of some form of white supremacy or mansplaining or whatever it might be. And if we were in a different era, if it was the 1950s in America, it would be communism and it would be McCarthy. It just so happens that at the moment there's a particular cohort which has the moral certainty, and wields it quite viciously. But you don't even have to get to the point at which you've gotten to nonetheless be impacted by this, because there's a whole ocean of other people who see your story and go, fuck, I'm not going to take on an issue that is really
That's the thing that I think that a lot of people don't realize, because it's not just, and this is why I think Sundance didn't realize and still hasn't realized, is when they apologized for my film and when Abigail Disney denounced my film and when South by and all the other film festivals pulled it right after the apology, you're rewarding bad behavior. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, so once you are able to establish a precedent that if you make enough noise, you can silence films, you can silence books, you can silence people, then that begets more of that behavior. And also it spreads fear. And what I mean by that is, I had a friend of mine who was working on a documentary in the Deep South about a funeral home there was a local hospital where there was a lot of bodies of young black men who were gay, who died of AIDS, and their family disowned them. And the hospital would dispose of the bodies like medical waste. But this funeral home decided to take it upon itself and give all these men a proper burial. And so they had a headstone in a place that eventually their families did want to come visit. It was there. And he was working on this film for about 6 months. And he was gay, but he was white. And then he saw what happened to me. And he stopped filming the film. And that's a story that will never be told, because he was scared, because he was not black. And he was telling a story of a population that he was not a part of, that he would be targeted. And he basically was just like, I don't want to lose my career over this. And so it's not the stories that you hear that get canceled. It's the ones that never get told because of the fear. Yeah.
It's the heckler's veto, basically, right? I mean, whoever shouts loudest gets to dictate what the contours of our conversation are. With a funny odd thing about that is that the other area in which there's a heckler's veto is jihadism, in the sense that the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, for example, when they shot up the Danish newspaper, the reason why you don't see images of the prophet in
the
cartoons,
Hemline University thing as well. Did that story make it over here?
No. What happened there?
There was a university, I think it's called Hemline University, and there was a professor teaching art history and religious art history. And she had, I guess, in her syllabus, she had a day or a couple classes that they were going to go over Islamic art. And there was a 14th century painting that was commissioned by a Muslim king in celebration of the Prophet Muhammad. And it was a painting of the Prophet Muhammad. And she, in the syllabus, said, if anyone feels uncomfortable, you don't have to come that day. She gave all the proper trigger warnings. Anyway, she showed the painting in her class in all the historical context. And then she wound up getting fired because some students complained.
Right. That's a better outcome than the French primary school teacher who got beheaded for doing a class about blasphemy and free speech in France. Obviously not beheaded by the French authorities, beheaded by a terrorist. But that just to make the analogy that I'm drawing perfectly explicit and politically incorrect, the behavior of people who try to punish you for telling the stories of these men is just a peaceful, non-violent way of doing functionally the same heckler's veto, of pulling off the same heckler's veto as the people who blow up a newspaper for publishing images of Muhammad, or behead somebody for teaching a class about blasphemy. It's basically saying you don't have the right to have conversations about this for whatever reason.
Yeah.
We're going to make life intolerable for people who do have conversations about this. And when we don't stand up to that, we become complicit in enforcing the heckler's veto. I mean, one sense that I had after Charlie Hebdo was that every newspaper in the world should have published the cartoons on the front page of the paper, even though I think they were probably tasteless and probably unwise and they were probably too insulting. And, you know, I understood the offence caused. But you have to have a cartel to stand. You have to have a sort of cartel of freedom to stand up in these cases.
What was interesting is, like, you know, I told you that the film got in all these film festivals, and then once Sundance apologized for it, it got pulled from all the rest except for one. So there was one film festival that did not pull the film, and they were the only ones to play it. And that was a film festival in New Zealand, of all places, called Dock Edge. And they played it, and it was the first time I got to see it on the big screen with a live audience. And I can't tell you how, like, emotional I got. I mean, I'd seen the film like 1,000 times, but when I saw it in front of a live audience, I heard people laugh and cry. It was just, and it was on my birthday too, so it was really emotional. But I remember going up to the director of the festival afterwards, and I asked him, I'm like, Alex, like, why didn't you pull the film with all these huge, like, South by Southwest is a huge fucking festival with countless resources and industry influence. And you are this, like, no offense, but you're a small documentary film festival in New Zealand on the other side of the world. Like, why didn't you pull the film when everyone else did? And he told me this story that really kind of just really touched me. And he said, you know, because we know what happens when you reward bad behavior. And apparently a couple years before, because he said, we've been down this road before. A couple years before my film played there was a film that people assumed they knew it was about. And there was a group of people that started protesting it, and they were harassing the staff at the festival, and they would start this whole, like, email campaign where they were telling people to boycott the festival and harassing volunteers and showing up at the office. Like, it got in real life kind of scary. And the festival refused to pull the film. And then the day it was supposed to premiere at this cinema in, I think, Auckland, the group that was attacking the film and harassing the film festival built a fake bomb with a timer and put it in the cinema. And then that caused the bomb squad and the special forces to be called in, and all the audience was told that there was a bomb in the building. They were all terrified, and everyone evacuated. And they found it with this timer on it, and it wound up being fake. But the festival did not play it. They just played it a different day. And I think that, like Alex said, like, if we had capitulated to that, then it just would have gotten worse and worse. And it would have been any film that someone had a problem with, we would be handing them the playbook on what to do if you want to get that film blacklisted. Yeah. And I think kudos to them. And so one of the reasons I'm back on this Southern Hemisphere is I was one of the few lucky ones that had the story kind of talked about in a huge publication like the New York Times. And right after that, I had a lot of people reach out, say, like, this happened to me too. But I also had a lot of people reach out and said, oh my God, you know, your story is, you know, really heart-wrenching. I want to help you. What can I do? Like, do you have a GoFundMe? I'm like, I don't, but maybe I should make one. And then I did. But it was after the New York Times piece dropped. And so the kind of the fervor had died down, and I made this GoFundMe, and I think we raised like $3,000, which in the self-distribution world is maybe enough to, like, get a poster made. Yeah. That's about it. Yeah. But then I went on the Sam Harris podcast, and he was generous enough to put it up without a paywall. And the interview kind of went viral, and the GoFundMe went from 3,000 to $750,000 in a couple of weeks. And from people all over the globe, and a disproportionate number were actually from Australia that kind of donated. And so I wanted to bring the film over here to say, like, thanks for doing this. This is amazing. But I stopped off on New Zealand because I believe in not rewarding bad behavior, but I also believe in rewarding good behavior. So I rented out this huge, like, 700-seat theater in Auckland and played the film there. It was a packed house, got a standing ovation. But 100% of the ticket sales, I donated to Dock Edge Film Festival. Because I was like, you guys did something good and you should be rewarded for that. So
That's great.
Yeah, no, they're awesome.
Fantastic. Good for them. Yeah, and good for Sam. Sam has lots of fans here and we love him. But I want to let you go, but you said to remind you about Monica Lewinsky.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So the funny thing is that as I've been going through this whole process, I've never thought this much about one person, but I've been thinking a lot about Monica Lewinsky. Because I remember in 1998, I was a senior in high school. And I remember hearing this story. And at the time, what was in the news and the narrative that was being kind of like all over the mainstream media was that this was a dumb bimbo that, seduced the president and, took advantage of this man and, she's a horrible person. And I believed that. And I believed 100% that that's who that person was and that's what had happened. And then fast forward 15, 20 years, I think, I saw her give a TED Talk. And far from being this like dumb bimbo, this was this very introspective, witty, self-reflexive, articulate woman who was such an impressive human being. And I realized that I had judged this person without ever meeting them or knowing anything about them. I just heard through, other people's opinions and other people's filter. And what was really interesting about the Sam Harris podcast was it was the first time I got to tell my side of the story like unfiltered, not through a journalist kind of using quotes in a story. And I think that there's a lot of power in to be able to speak to people directly, which is what the film is about, right? You have these men who for 20 years, their stories have been redacted and you've never heard directly from them. And this is their chance to talk directly to you. And there's power in having that human connection between people and be able to have difficult conversations and nuanced conversations, but in a humane and complex way. And I think that, the day before Sundance announcement, if you Googled my name, you'd probably get Meg Smaker, firefighter, Stanford, kidnapped, whatever. And then the day after, you get Meg Smaker, white supremacist, Islamophobe. And it's a really weird experience to have your complete identity kind of be hijacked and then be taken over and be projected as kind of the opposite of what you are and having zero control over that. And I just feel like this whole experience has taught me about like, there's only two ways to go through life. You can go through life in a state of judgment or a state of curiosity. And I can hear a story and just completely judge this person. And that's easy to do. The harder thing, though, is to keep an open mind and try to be curious about someone. And I think this is kind of re-instilled in me that I need to be better about being curious about the world and being curious about people rather than, just judging them off a soundbite or a 20-second clip I see on YouTube or all that kind of stuff.
Well, fantastic. I think you're doing it. And hopefully we're helping by having uncomfortable conversations from time to time. It's lovely to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Too. Oh, I should say because this is gonna air when it's online, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the film, hopefully, by the time you hear this, will be online, and so you can see it for yourself and make up your own mind. And if you watch it and you hate it, that's fine. At least you've watched it. Just watch it first before you hate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you'll be able to watch it on jihadrehab.com, and hopefully it will be available pretty soon. And yeah, watch it and let me know what you think. And if you like it and you think Sundance did wrong by it, you should probably reach out to them and let them know. How about that? How about that, Sundance?
I love it. Thanks, man.
Thank you.